We got married in 1948.
That's pretty much around the same time as when the state was founded.
Right.
More or less.
We were married in Israel.
Right?
Oh, we were married the week that the state of Israel was founded. We spent all our time listening to the radio.
Is that right?
Yeah, you know, it wasn't
They
the
read
exact
the book?
date because we listened to the United Nations and all that stuff on our honeymoon.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Was it really touch and go?
What, the
What would we
honeymoon?
listen to the vote in the United
The
Nations?
honeymoon
Not the
of Israel.
Not the honeymoon, but I love that. That's very, very good. This whole conversation is...
Honeymoon was mostly touch more than go, right?
I think we'll just edit that line out. No, it's very cute.
What is... you probably remember what your impressions were. I mean, what was it like? I mean, where...
Tremendous excitement.
I'm talking now about when you came to Hamilton, which I...
Oh, when we
imagine is
came to
also
Hamilton.
tremendously
When we got
exciting.
married, which was when Israel was established,
Right.
1948, my husband had a congregation in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
You want to know what Hamilton was like?
Just a minute, we hadn't come to Hamilton.
Well, she's asking what was Hamilton like when
I'm
we got
saying
here.
how we got to Hamilton. First, it's very important to understand why we came to Hamilton.
Why was that?
Because I couldn't stand the southern part of the United States in 1948.
That's why we left Baton Rouge.
And
It's
we
not why
decided
came
to
Hamilton.
leave.
Was there any segregation in
Any. I mean, this is Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
I know.
And we couldn't find, this was a congregation that was open, that offered us a job. And we were just young and married and thought it would be fun to come to another country for a year, right?
That's about it.
Yeah. So that's when we came to Hamilton.
What Hamilton was like is interesting, and I would have to discourse on this theme for a while if you're interested.
I would love to hear. I would love to hear, and I would love...
All right, let him
If
talk.
my wife
For
will
you to
defer
come
to
to
me.
Okay, I'll be quiet.
By
Let
all
him
means,
talk.
by all means. Both. I want to hear from you, Marjorie.
Hamilton was a community which, for the most part, was economically and socially lower class, with a modicum of middle class people. Jews had only made some money during the war. During the Second World War, the Jewish community only made some money. Prior to that time, it was in many ways a sort of depressed community.
You're talking now about the
19th Jewish community, yes.
Okay.
This is, and this is in the post-war years, in the early post-war years. But things changed quite radically after that. Several things were interesting in those days. For example, there was a strong Yiddishist movement, which no longer existed. And this paralleled the kind of Yiddishist movement which died in the United States very, very quickly.
I've got to go and put some earrings on.
Stalinism, when Stalinism died, and when in the post-war era suburban Judaism developed with new synagogues and more middle-class people, the whole Yiddishist shula that was here for many, many years, and the Jewish People Worker Order, Jewish People's Workers Order, which was a
United Jewish People Order.
which was a communist group
Huge
that
deal.
folded. It was amazing how within a decade or 15 years, all of this leftist working Jewish sentiment faded. There was a Jewish community center on John Street on the north end of town, which had very limited significance, and the Jewish religious life was on a low level as well. There was the Anshe Shalom synagogue, which was very small, and to a large degree the community was unchurched, unsynagogued. And it's only in the years flowing in the next 2 decades that we began to build up the congregations. We moved from where we had been downtown. We were the first congregation to move up to Westdale. We used to take new members into the congregation at $36 annually. And I remember my membership chairman would call me every night and say, "We've got 2 new members, 2 new members." And this was the period of great growth. When I got here and didn't intend to stay, the congregation had maybe 120 families.
It was 120.
About something like that, 120 families,
Right.
or thereabouts. A couple of years later, when we moved out, we were about 300. And that growth was phenomenal because it was part of this whole post-war expansion, this suburban, kind of tying your loyalty now not to leftist organizations, which had very little religious significance, but to congregations. And the growth of Beth Jacob, which also moved out to this part of town, was characteristic of this growth in the liberal congregation, and then eventually the Orthodox congregation, which moved from where they had been on Cannon Street, which was a small Polish immigrant congregation, moved out here in the glorious edifice. It was all Jews made money, so right away you had a whole different configuration where religion was concerned. And these congregations built schools. For a while, a Jewish community center on Delaware. I remember the dedication of that structure. Opened with great eclat, you know. Everybody thought this was going to be the great thing for the Jewish community. And the Goldblatts, of course, were very much instrumental in providing.
They had a previous Jewish community center, remember, on John Street
Yeah, I mentioned
North?
that when you.
Oh, you mentioned that, sorry.
Yeah, it didn't amount to very much, and this was going to, in many ways, revolutionize things. Well, it was a big advance, big step forward. Jews, unfortunately, didn't continue to live in that part of Eastern Hamilton and moved
Do
away.
you remember the year of that building, Delaware Avenue, when it?
No,
It
but
could have been around, well, we were here. We had just come. Ken Sobel was responsible for that. It would be 1949, 1950, and I'm sure that somebody somewhere's got some records of it.
of course, it's later. I think it's later than
In
that.
what way, excuse me, was Ken Sobel responsible?
He was
He
very
was the
much
chairman
involved in
of
raising the
the
funds and
building
committee.
committee,
Yes. Yeah, he was the dominant figure apart from the Goldblatt family,
The Goldblatt family.
Wendy's family.
Can you just say a few words about Ken Sobel? We're trying to get a picture of who this man was.
Ken Sobel was the guy who founded CHCH. He was a very creative personality, the best known Jew in the community, highly visionary, was very much involved in the in the whole renewal project downtown, and so forth and so on. He was the prominent Jew of the time, died unfortunately quite young.
Yeah, he was a great guy.
He was a great guy.
I remember bringing him over here to meet Sid Bloom. That's Mary Bloom DeVore's husband, who came as a social worker to the Social Planning and Research Council because Ken was interested in social renewal in the downtown, and I remember distinctly a conversation they had about how some people cannot live in houses without destroying them, a certain element of society, and Ken was thinking of building buildings with cement seats and cement beds and stuff like that. And I remember the conversations that the two of them had. I introduced
Was
them.
Ken a Temple member?
No, he was.
He belonged to Beth Jacob.
He also
You
built.
should know that
He had
because-
CHML. CHML was his work, and then CHCA. He was a big radio, television personality, and much of the early days of radio in Hamilton was Ken Sobel and CHML.
He started the amateur hour. This is CHML.
There was a story about him recently in the
Francis,
newspaper.
Last weekend.
Careful, that comes apart. Frances Sobel was a lovely lady. Her maiden name was Libel, Libel. A real elegant lady, but they did a wonderful job of raising three very unspoiled girls, all of whom I think have gone on to do well for themselves.
To come back to the story of Hamilton, so over a period of 20 years or so, there was a transformation in the community in many, many ways. Religiously, there was a kind of burgeoning, a kind of efflorescence in the whole, and the death of the leftist, as I've mentioned to you. There was a guy, Kunigis, here in town who ran the Shula, who was a well-known personality, went to Winnipeg, and everything died with his departure. It was the most interesting demise. Then, of course, the congregations became more dominant with each of their programs. The Jewish Community Center became a force in the town. And then Jewish organizations organized, and you had them affiliated with the center, Jewish Federation, and so forth. And I remember 23 organizations in those days. And then Orthodoxy, which had been a very small and in many ways immigrant kind of population, grew and their children became more dominant in the community, American educated,
Well, that's only been
Canadian
the last
educated.
20 years.
No, later, longer than that. Girls never went to school, by the way, in those early days. Girls didn't go to university. Very, very few. As a matter of fact, I remember people used to put BA next to their names on their letterheads, you know.
Oh,
So very few people were university
Yeah, I
educated.
saw some statistics recently. I didn't realize. My daughter, who is a Jewish scholar, and can hear a lot about her, gave a speech once. I think it was our 35th wedding anniversary, in which she talked about Mike being a college graduate, which evidently was a big deal in those days. I didn't really realize it, but she was very aware of it.
Few women went to university. Generally, today it's hard to realize how few people really went on to university in those early days. 50 years ago, you know.
Though on the other hand, you had three women doctors in town, which is interesting.
Jewish?
Yes, Fran Levy, Dr. Dan Levy's wife, she was a doctor. Lottie Martin, Phil Martin's wife, was a doctor, practiced. And there was a woman named Miriam Yallis. You know David Yallis? Don't you know David Yallis? His father had what's called home outfitting, and his mother was a MD.
I remember the yes.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that, in a way, that's very interesting that there were three
Sure.
women doctors in Hamilton.
A long time ago, yes.
Very interesting. But when you, Rabbi Baskin, pointed out earlier that this was largely, when you came, an unchurched community, I'm kind of curious because in those days there were at least four synagogues in town. There was the
Ferguson Avenue and Hess Street.
Ferguson,
Very small
Beth
steeples,
Jacob,
very small
very
steeples.
small steeples, very small steeples. But the sense that I would have is that people went. They may not have been very scholarly.
They didn't. There were ways of going to shul for Yontif and so forth, but they weren't members in our sense. Maybe they made contributions. The fact that we picked up all of these people in a relatively short period of time who are not members anywhere is an indication there was a large mass of Jews who are culturally Jewish, members of the Jewish people, leftist, concerned, but not identified in the way that we identify Jews these days, you know, disorganized.
But they were also, their social life all centered around. I play mahjong in my old age with two sisters, Bella Mueller and Helen Yellen, and they have a third sister here. They were Zuckers. Their cousin was Zeke Zucker, and they lived here. And they'd be a wonderful couple to interview. They know the Yiddish, and from playing Maj with them over the years, the two of them together, they number one love Yiddish, and they talk about what it was like in the old days. And it's most interesting to listen to them.
Absolutely.
Their father was called a Bodkin. Was that the word I told you?
Botkin, yeah.
About he would sing.
He would go at the weddings, and he
Nice.
would introduce people when they came in. I never been at something like that. And
When-
he would make poems up.
The membership of the temple, you said, went from about 120 when you first arrived to about 300 in the first
In the first 20 years, yeah.
in the first 20 years. People joined the temple. Why? Because
Because the second,
You were here
because the
quite some time.
second generation, and something of the third generation, were now Canadian rather than immigrant. Liked the nature of the service. Much of it was in English. Women especially didn't know Hebrew. We had a religious school which some people thought was superior. There was for many years a Talmud Torah. They used to meet at the Jewish Community Center.
right.
We never were part of that, the congregation, because it was run along what we thought was traditional lines, and things were done and said that we weren't happy with. There was a rabbi here in town called Herbert Wiener, recently deceased, unfortunately.
Not Herbert.
Eugene Wiener, excuse me, Eugene Wiener, recently deceased in Israel.
Thinking about Herbert Wiener, 9.5 Mystics.
Yes. Bern is a friend of Bernie's.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
He taught at Haifa.
Yes, he taught in Haifa.
Eugene did.
Yeah, he was in Russia also for a
And then
while.
he and his wife went to
Region.
Russia.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anyway, he
for a while.
died
They were
recently.
nice people.
He left, he took Beth Jacobs Religious School out of the center school, and that pretty well killed the school. Of course, when Addis Israel got started, they wanted their school under their own auspices, and so the whole business of the Talmud Torah. But in any case, people joined the congregation and joined the temple for those reasons and others.
Well, to be perfectly honest, from a human point of view, there was the same old business with the German Jews and the Polish Jews. There was
But there were no German Jews left at the temple.
Well, there were, and don't forget, you're talking about the 1920s. There was the Levy family, and there was a perception on the part of the others that we were a bunch of snobs, which I guess they were. I'm a German Jew myself. My family is German Jew.
There were no German Jewish influence at the temple we got here except for residual influence. It was called the Deutsche Schule.
It's like people take a long time to change their mind.
No, I'm not
things.
suggesting there were.
Right now, to this day, I mean, Helen Yellen said to me the other day, I went to a bar mitzvah at the temple, and the boy did well, remarkably well. So I said, why are you surprised? I said, because you think the Reform Jews don't take things seriously. She says, I guess you're right. I mean, we've been playing mahjong for 5 years together by now, but we're always going back and forth about this Reform Judaism
but that
thing.
you would agree is
No, in the community.
perceptions that numbers of people have of the temple. I think you're
And we have perceptions.
Don't you remember there was a picket of the kosher butcher store?
So?
It was on Rosh Hashanah. Morris Gelber had a kosher butcher store which the Orthodox said wasn't kosher enough. And they actually picketed. So the three different congregations were really at...
When you were already here?
We were down at the old synagogue on Houston Street, so that was a long time ago.
There was, well, it was a bit of a scandal. I forget the years.
Yeah,
It must go back 30 years or more. There was some feeling that the kosher butcher store wasn't really kosher, that he was adding non-kosher.
That's more than 30 years ago.
Maybe more than 40 years ago. I don't know.
Honey,
I'm here 32
Let me
years.
handle it.
I'm here 32
But Bernard,
years.
your perception of time is a little distorted.
In any case, it may be 40 years.
Well, certainly around
So there was a perception that Morris Gelber's meat wasn't strictly
Right, wasn't kosher. And there were some people who took an active stand to try to...
This was over 50 years ago.
Try to
We
shut it
dedicated
down?
our building when my son was, and my son is now 52, and he was just born. Was when we were on Houston Street, so and David is 52.
I can't
50.
vouch for the...
I'll tell you, I know the
Dates.
date. He doesn't know the date.
Were
I-
they trying to shut him down with this demonstration?
I don't know. They had pamphlets.
You could ask Riva. It would be fun to put something like that
She's
in.
my cousin.
I don't think that would be proper to put in. And I don't know how long it lasted. And they issued little pamphlets and broadsides distributed in the congregations. And of course, the allegations were hotly denied. What truth there was in it, I don't know. The thing died. I think Gelber gave up the business, right? And
I don't know, dear.
I think they gave up the business.
That's what makes books.
And for a long time, a lot of people in the community felt that they were not really kosher, that he was introducing.
Very nice.
I'm not sure the mashgiach was in those days or whatever. That was a bit of a scandal. I've forgotten all about that. I think it was short-lived.
Sure. I mean, these things go on to this very day. They go on in Montreal.
Yeah.
I mean, they go on everywhere, you know?
Right.
As far as the community, there, of course, in the early days was a lot of inter-religious animus.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask about. I mean,
Especially the temple was looked upon by many members of the community as a strange, bizarre place, you know, these German Jews, silent prayer, you know.
well, it sort of picks up on what you were saying.
Yeah, but it's interesting how when time went on, because it's a small community, and because a lot of the original traditional Jews became Reform Jews, and you got all of this intermingling, a lot of this initial animosity had to pass. Because if you didn't like the temple, you didn't like where your daughter was going, or your son-in-law, you know. So Hamilton has been quite good in the last generation in terms of very good congregational understanding. The rabbis have gotten together very well as well. It's not like Montreal or Toronto.
But it's an interesting thing how people who share similar experiences sometimes end up with different perspectives on how to interpret those experiences. So
Sure.
my guess would be, Marjorie, to be honest, I mean, I might be out of line in thinking this, that you really don't see it exactly
That's exactly right.
as
I mean, think of the people that wouldn't get married, whose kids didn't get married in your temple because the families objected, and that happens to this day.
Well, of course. On the other hand, how many are already getting married in our place whose folks used to be members of the other congregations?
I know, Bernard, my husband has a very optimistic.
Knowing other.
And he also, and Rabbi Green has never been in our synagogue for a service. Young Rabbi Green has been, but not the older Rabbi Green. Never once came. So don't tell me that things have got. You've been nice.
Taking into account the depth of animosity that exists in Toronto and Montreal,
Sure.
we are much, much better in every sense. It may be religiously, there's some hesitation, but in terms of social and cultural activities, Yom HaShoah, Yom HaTzmaut, we've had them at the temple and people come. You can't keep up these animosities in a small place like Hamilton.
No, it's...
Some people get a great kick out of it. My son-in-law, I have a son-in-law who his wife belongs to Holy Blossom and his kid's bar mitzvah there, but he doesn't like Reform Jews, you know. So, I mean, this is still going on.
Well, he's a victim of his upbringing, I mean.
So are all these people.
Well, of course. We gravitate toward ideas which are instilled upon us in our youth, right?
And then it carried over to the kids. I mean, you never knew my kids. There really was a real split between Beth Jacob kids and Anshe Sholem kids.
Youth groups, yeah.
And I think there was even some incident at Beth Jacob where you had a dance and they wouldn't let the kids from the temple in.
Even in my father's generation, we interviewed my father yesterday, and he said, you know, the Beth Jacob kids, there was a rivalry with the Beth Jacob and the Addis young people, and the temple people were just out of the picture.
Yeah.
There was no association.
Well, I think your father one time went out with Adele Minden. I know this, and Louis and Anna would have known nothing of that.
Say that again? Because
Louis and Anna were our members, and you know, I mean.
they weren't happy because he was not a
And
temple
Lou
member.
Levy, the accountant, wanted to take out Leo Barnett's daughter, and that was broken up too.
Because they were temple members?
Yeah.
I don't think so, Marge. He just didn't like the fact that he
Dear,
came
I
from an
know,
impoverished
dear.
background.
Bernard justified it. He's really such a sweet guy.
It's sociologically, you can't look at one strain in the tapestry when there are many that go to make up the total picture, right?
But it's so much, it's interesting to talk about these individual cases. You have to.
Oh, it's too bad.
No, Leo Barnett was a very wealthy guy, and they were patrician. Lou Levy came from a very poor Polish immigrant background with no money, so it wasn't religious so much as.
He was determined to marry a rich girl, and he did.
Okay.
He married
But
another.
it wasn't. But the point is,
another one of the temple
it wasn't
family.
religious. That was the basis for the dislike.
Honey, it was the background. It doesn't
Background.
matter.
But the point of the matter is that when you arrive in Hamilton and become involved with the temple, the contacts between the different synagogues
Very limited.
very, very,
Very limited.
And I tried very hard to change that.
How did you do that?
Well, I had before I got out of the Rebbitzin business, I got a joint sisterhood group. All three sisterhoods, we met together 3 times a year. Marnie Pakin was the president of our sisterhood at that time. The thing that was much different when we came, and I think it's true all over, and in my memoir, which I started but I never got finished with, I got talking about, I've thought about it a lot. When I came to Hamilton, women did not work. Most women did not work. There really were quite a few who did, But the idea was to stay home and have kids and get involved in activities. So I was very involved with the sisterhood. The temple people were involved with the sisterhood, the National Council of Jewish Women, and somewhat with Hadassah, because the whole history of Reform Judaism was not particularly pro-Zionist. So you haven't got. Then, like Bella and Helen, their families were very involved with the JNF, the Orthodox Witzo. I don't remember what it's called.
Emuna.
Yeah.
Or Mizrahi.
And that's right. And they'll tell you stories. Helen is a wonderful person to go to see.
Next week.
Yeah, because she has stories, and she talked about going around with her father to collect for JNF and so forth. So that even the organizations that the temple members of the Beth Jacob, they all belonged to, were different. And we were very involved with the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods, and on the national level, you see. But the women worked, and you didn't have they really got their social life, their directions, learning how to cook and everything else from the
Sure.
other women.
Coming, I was just curious, coming from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, was it culture shock for you to come?
Well, number one, Bernard comes from New York and I come from Denver. And we both had college degrees and so forth. And we knew that it wasn't culture shock.
There were some shocks. I think it was largely the Canadian way in those years, which was far more provincial than it is today.
Yeah.
And the whole Jewish community was very provincial, as I've tried to
But
indicate
they
to you.
didn't have Christmas trees like they did in Denver. They didn't celebrate Christmas.
No,
They were much more pro-Israel.
This was a community one generation removed from the old country.
Oh,
A generation and a
I
half.
thought you were going to say something just slightly different. I thought you were going to say that this was a community that was one generation removed from the United States.
Well, that's what Mordechai Kaplan said, one generation removed from degeneration. No, but they were a generation and a half from the old country.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked in many ways by what I thought were provincial attitudes, lack of sophistication. Tremendous change in the community in half a century has been affluence, sophistication, and education. All of these things are tremendous changes in the Hamilton Jewish community and in Canadian Jewish life generally. It went from a very provincial, isolated community, little thought of, in the post-war era, tremendous changes, and along these lines, much more money, much more knowledge, third generation, much more affluence, much more sophistication, traveled, and a breakdown in tradition.